Okay, so let's hit space to get out of that, and let's get a little bit of a better view, encompassing a little bit more of these guys and maybe the shadows they'll produce. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit the render button so we can get a rendered image of what we're looking at. Okay, so here we can see all these neat colors affecting each other, bouncing off these objects, and the effect that it's having on the shadows as well. Even though we have the color of the shadow is by default set to black, because we've changed these individual colors of these lamps, it's affecting these shadows as well. Now if we change the shadow color, it would definitely affect the way that was working and the way that looked, especially if this was at white. These shadows produced here are a lot crisper and smoother than say the buffer shadow. They're a little too crisp. They don't blur quite enough. There's not much smoothing. So how do we smooth the edges of these shadows? First of all, that's controlled in how many samples that we have. So what it means by samples is that this is one sample. Each one of these lights is producing one sample. So that's one basically shadow shape, you can kind of think of it, that's being rendered and produced. So if we set the samples to 2, then it would be having to render this entire scene's shadows, and then what it's going to do is offset those shadows a little bit and render it again, and then blur the result of those 2 shadow images to create a smoother edge. Now obviously the more samples we use, the smoother of these edges of the shadows are going to be. So for instance, when we rendered that, it took 7.14 seconds. But if we increase these samples to say 5, and the soft size, which this is basically the blur effect that happens between these different samples. So if I increase the soft size to say around 3, and that's just changing the effects for the first lamp. So I'm not sure actually which shadows this will affect, but we'll go ahead and click render, and we see that this first point lamp somewhere on this scene here is affecting this shadow and that shadow more than it is the others. So we kind of begin to see the effects of this. But so if we go down to each one of these 4 lights we created earlier, and we increase these samples to 5. One other thing real quick, when I click back on the first one, you'll see that this setting was set to adaptive QMC, and adaptive sampling is faster, but to me almost never a trustworthy result, so I do not ever use adaptive. Use constant. It takes a little longer, but the results are always nicer. On this second point light, I've already got these samples bumped up to 5. I'm going to change the soft size to about 3 and make sure constant QMC is on, and do the same for the rest, for the next 2. If I select on slot 2 and I render over this one so we can compare now all the softened edge shadows with the original. Okay, so now we've got all these smoothed edges as compared to the first one. If I just tap J, so yeah, you can see how increasing the samples and the soft size, which is basically the blur of those samples, changes the effects of those shadows.